Real happy to have this next gentleman on the Sports Card Shop guest line. I've spoke to him before on our conglomerate show, Hobby Hotline, but asked him to come on this program, and he's graciously decided to do so, and I'm glad for that. I want to welcome Mr. Ryan Stuczynski from Gemrate. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you having me. Excited to
Well,
chat.
yeah, thank you for being here. Before we get it, we're gonna definitely deep dive into GemRate, which I think is a great thing you're doing and very informative. You know, kind of the standard podcast, first time on the show kind of question, sort of your hobby background, like whether collecting cards, did you do it as a kid, and kind of the trajectory to where we are now today.
Yeah, so I have a pretty familiar story, but my sort of beginnings were around the late 80s, early 90s. But some of the sort of distinct memories I have is my dad's buddy had a collection and he asked me to sort of price it out for him. And so it was, none of the cards that I had been, I just got into cards at that stage. I was 8, 9 years old, but it was all this vintage and he asked me to just price it out. So my dad bought me a Beckett and I just sort of went through and was pricing everything out. And it's funny now, I look back and I'm like, I'm still asking my dad, I'm like, hey, we should revisit this collection. It had some great cards in there, a ton of, 60s cards that would be worth, and they were in pretty decent condition. But
Yeah.
that was sort of one of my initial sort of like research projects into it. And then I really got into more of the, the junk wax stuff. And I was heavy into that. But I was a horrible collector as a kid. I was selling everything I could to open the next pack of cards. So my collection, when I took a pack out, 10 years ago, was worth nothing. I didn't even have the junk wax sort of collection that everybody else had. I had sort of just, hundreds of cards instead of the thousands because I had sold so much of it off as a kid. Um, and then I got back
Well,
into
you
it.
might not to cut you off. I think you were ahead of the curve, Ryan, because depending on what you had, you probably did better selling it then than maybe today. You might have been the smartest guy in the room.
Well, I had a lot of fun. I didn't make any money doing it, but I loved ripping packs. I mean, it was just,
Yeah.
every year for the holidays, I got one box of cards that I was allowed to pick out. It was like my big gift. And it was, in between that, it was just sort of when I could sort of put together pennies to go to the card shop, ride my bike and, pick up a nice $3 to $5 pack of cards with some buddies, which I would immediately sell whatever came out of that pack so I could do it again. And so anyways, it was, and I carried that for a long time. And, as I got back into the hobby, in 2020, it was, trying to drop that and put a little bit more discipline into my sort of behavior as it relates to just like collecting cards and building out a much truer collection that I thought was more to my style. But I loved it. And I was a big stats junkie. I've told this on a couple podcasts before, but I was doing fantasy football at the same time in 1990. My dad and I were doing fantasy football. So I love stats. I was super into that. We were, faxing in our lineup and waiting, checking newspaper stats to sort of see how our players were performing. We would find out if we won or lost 2 days later. But there was a lot of sort of my intro was paired with sort of fantasy and then also cards at the same time. And that sort of was something that I revisited, like a lot of people in the at the time of this, at the start of the pandemic. I had been paying a lot of attention, but I wasn't actively participating. And I got caught up. I was like, I'm too much of a numbers guy and too into sort of the sort of, I have a background in finance and I have
Yeah.
a background in data. And it was just like, why am I not participating in this market when it seems like it's thriving and there's just a lot of opportunity to participate in a way that would be fun for me? It was just like a perfect sort of merging of my interest. And so that's sort of where I was and then kind of how I got here.
Yeah, and so even at an early age, you were in the stats and numbers, and I mean, it just sort of you stayed along that path with, like you said, finance and data and all that. So you sort of knew early on, maybe not necessarily exactly what you were going to do, but you knew you liked that sort of thing. It was right up your alley.
Oh, I loved it. Yeah, it's just there's something about sort of the um, I really just love fantasy football, and so that was so interesting to me. And then I just like the idea of sort of like trying to understand performance and how it can impact sort of at the time it was cards, although it was not nearly as dramatic, and just sort
Yeah.
of the idea of research. I really like research. Research has always sort of been my angle into this, which is just like if you do the work, you can kind of find out interesting things that other people aren't, who aren't putting in the work or just having a different approach to people in the market, whether that's again fantasy sports or collecting cards. And so it was really the research element that got me excited about it, and that's really sort of what's just driven me from the early '90s until now. Is just doing a lot of work behind the scenes that maybe taking an approach that other people aren't thinking about.
So when did you first start? Most people, I think, in the hobby, or a good percentage, let me put it that way, know what gem rate is and what you do, and it's very detailed. And I think it's obviously progressed from when you first launched to where you are now, where you basically, and you do it daily. I mean, it's, you do your yearly, you have your yearly report, your monthly report, but you can go on your website each day and kind of see what happened, in the sense the day before, by grading company, by even, you've got it now down to even, categorized with trading card games and the different sports. You got it by even player. You got like boxing cards, something I dabble a little bit in. I mean, you got it really, like, categorized to categories that, I can imagine that that's hard to do. But what was it? When did you first start thinking about this is kind of a direction you wanted to go in? And it's something I think the hobby needs, and wasn't, PSA had their own sort of published, report, but to do it across the board. When did the light bulb go on for you, and with your background, said, hey, this is something I could tackle and do it very well, hopefully, and do it.
Yeah, I was working on a couple projects prior to this. One was actually related to fantasy sports, where I was aggregating data across different projections to use it to sort of help me with just sort of making decisions. I was doing a lot of like daily fantasy sports, so like DraftKings and FanDuel, and I just really, again, I love the data. I love the idea of sort of having an approach that might not be sort of very common, and using that data to my advantage. And so I had gotten building up a little bit of momentum on that front, and I just was looking at I spent a lot of money when I got back into cards. I was just overwhelmed and so interested in so many different pockets. And, again, you learn so quickly. It's so easy to buy and so hard to sell. And so, I was quickly just thinking about, okay, now I've built up this collection. What do I actually care about? What do I sort of want to move out of my collection? And, I had a lot of raw cards, and I was just thinking about, how do I optimize sort of, what this collection is that I've built? Are there opportunities to grade some cards and potentially sell them? And so I was just doing a lot of research on it, and it was hard. Candidly, it was just hard. The pop reports, at the time, PSA was still on an old site. There are the pop reports, while they've made some improvements over the years, at that time were pretty rough, and you couldn't get data out of them. And they had a very strong opinion on one way that you could sort of navigate them. And so I really wanted to think about, okay, I was so tired of copying data into Excel or into Google Sheets, and I was like, is there a way that I can use what I've been building for sort of the fantasy stuff that I was doing, and actually use this for the card world and actually add value over the long run? And I started to think about, okay, the pop reports, if I were to sort of take that data and repackage it in a way that was, just a different approach that allowed you to sort of cut and slice the data differently. And then also maybe even, the dream was to build this idea where I could, not just look at one grader's data, but look at all graders' data in sort of one universal fashion. And so I started to do the work on just what that would take. And then, as a part of that process, I was learning a lot about PSA and sort of their momentum. And I started to think about, okay, I'm going to do the dirty work of grabbing all this data. But I learned a lot about what was happening at PSA. And I said, I was just thinking that maybe if I start publishing this, people appreciate sort of some of the insight that I'm pulling out of this, or some of the high level macro trends that you could determine as it relates to like what PSA is grading, how that sort of relates to what was happening with the backlog at the time. There were a lot of questions. And so I just started to put together the content side of it, just as a way to sort of bring more transparency into what was happening. It was partially just to build the brand. Gemrate, I wanted to stand for very trusted data in this hobby. And so if I could sort of just paint the picture of what was happening from a grading standpoint, I thought that would be a nice way to, before I was really in the market with sort of population tools and ways for you to sort of really drill into the data, I just thought I could speak to sort of some of the macro trends. And so we did that with PSA. And that was really well received. It was the first time that anybody was really sort of speaking towards the volume and the different breakout of what was being graded, and then really getting into the cards. I mean, the first report I published showed that there were about 50,000 Michael Jordan cards, which was a ton at the time. I think maybe there was, I don't know, it was like 500,000 cards that PSA was sort of outputting at that time. So about 10%, one out of every 10 cards graded was a Jordan card. And I think, it was sort of highlighting what a lot of people knew, but didn't necessarily have data to support, which was like, people are going into their basements, digging up all their old collections and throwing it at PSA or any other grading company to see that there's value there. And that's sort of how the backlog really accumulated. And beyond that, I took a step back and said, you know what, I don't want to just do this for PSA, and especially if I want to build out this concept of a universal pop report. And so I started to collect the data from the other graders, and everything's pulled from the pop reports. You know, I only leverage what's publicly available. I don't have any direct feeds into any of the companies. I want to make sure that I can speak to the same data that everybody else sees, and I also don't want to just be feeding data in from a company without any sort of context. And so I started to bring on Beckett and SGC and CSG once, and CGC when they made their pop reports live. And that was sort of the where I built the momentum, was just speaking towards sort of the broader landscape and giving people some insight into what's going in and out of the grading companies, how is sort of share breaking down between, you know, just the high level and also sort of some of the category stuff, and even at the card level, just where are people sending certain cards. And it certainly was very enlightening for me to understand, as somebody who had been out of the hobby, sort of like what the momentum looked like. And it's really funny that when you look back and sort of some of the grading data, it's like, wow, it's dramatically different than how it was 5-10 years ago. So I learned a lot really quickly, and I just wanted to share some of what I was picking up. And fortunately, the hobby has received the data really well.
Yeah, I mean, you know this as well as I do, Ryan. I myself will retweet something you put out, or you know, a stat that I find sort of interesting and want to share kind of with fellow hobbyists. You know, how received were you as far as from the grading companies themselves? Did you hear from them at all? Did they like it? Did they offer any resistance? Did you not? Like, what kind of relationship, if any, with these grading card companies?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there was some skepticism when I first started doing it. You know, it wasn't clear what my motivations were. You know, nobody had really done that. It's a lot of work, which is part of the reason I did this. Was I knew you couldn't just sort of like dabble and pull this off. Like, I knew I was going to have to put in a decent chunk of my own money to sort of stand this sort of project up and build it into a company. And you know, it was not something you could just do as like a data science project, or for a blog purpose. And so, you know, I'd done a lot of work on it. And when I started publishing it, I definitely had some, you know, people that were saying, hey, we like what you're doing. We'd like to learn a little bit more about it. You know, PSA specifically at the time was saying, hey, you know, we appreciate what you're doing. We'd like to learn a little bit more about your process. I told them, hey, I'm just pulling stuff in a pop report. And they were generally okay with it. And at the same time, you know, that sort of, you know, they took it as an opportunity for them to say, why are we letting somebody else do this? Why don't we just publish some of this data on our own? Which was great. I didn't ever sort of go into this thinking that I needed to be sort of the source of truth. I just wanted to sort of shed some light on where the momentum was. And you kind of have seen that story evolve. PSA has sort of let me run with a lot of sort of the what's been graded story, but they're doing a lot more around like what's been submitted, which is actually really interesting data as well. And they may end up taking, you know, another shot at sort of some of the things I've been doing. But PSA was sort of the first one that I was focused on, and the one that was sort of responding to how I was publishing data, or sort of just like weighing in. And, you know, generally speaking, again, they were okay with it. And as I started to bring on other data sources, you know, there was always sort of some question marks around just like, why is Ryan and Gemrate's data different than what we're seeing internally? And I had to sort of walk people through the idea of, look, it's just your pop report data. There's nothing more to it. And so, you know, what you ship and sort of what you look at internally may not necessarily jive with what hits the pop report. There could be a day lag. There could be many days lag there. And with Beckett, you know, there was still a lot of issues with them syncing historical data. And so, you know, I had to sort of caveat a lot of stuff and just make sure people understood, like, hey, this is directionally right for a lot of these companies, but on a day-to-day basis, you need to sort of like, you know, just know that there's some variance here. But the weekly and monthly trends are really telling. And I think over time, people realize, number one, I'm not trying to like, you know, there's no deeper story here. I'm not trying to sort of like show people sort of what's going on behind the scenes, or sort of, you know, unveil some data that people have never seen before in a way that they would never expect to see it. It's more just telling the story. And I think people realize that there was a good intentions here, and the grading companies have received it really well. So I now have on occasion a conversation with somebody at the company just around, one, they'll reach out to me and just say, you know, hey, this is something to be aware of on our end. You know, we were training people today, and so you're going to see our numbers dip for a couple of days. It's just something for you to be aware of. Or I'll see something on my end and I'll say, hey, it looks like you just, you know, unexpectedly added a bunch of cards to a certain category. Is this you guys recategorizing stuff? Did you just bring the set onto the pop report that didn't exist? And so, you know, there's a lot of clarification, but at the end of the day, they've signed off on sort of the idea of, look, better data is better for the hobby. And, you know, this is one of those themes that I've really sort of been trying to reinforce, which is, you know, there's some part of the hobby, which is fun in the sense that the data is not perfect. And there's elements of like, you can have your own sort of story and journey through the data and make sense of it in sort of your own way. But there's some of this that could be standardized and sort of better distributed, and that's part of what the Gemrate story is just bringing some higher level macro data to help just people understand sort of what's happening in the hobby. So there was caution to sort of the short answer. There was caution, but I think people, once they saw that it was a small operation here, with good intentions and the idea of just bringing better data to hobby participants and also hopefully bringing more people into the hobby as a result of better data, I think people sort of were like, okay, we kind of get it. We're okay with it.
And hey, free promotion for them, right? You're talking about them. You're highlighting that that's what they're doing and that sort of thing. Do you get I don't, whether it was in the beginning or even now? Do you get much like, hey, that's not accurate, like from them, like you know what I mean? Like it's nice that you said they can give you sort of a heads up. Hey, we're doing this. This is why you may see this. Do they ever say, hey, that doesn't appear right, or where'd that number come? Do you ever get much of that, or do they pay much attention internally?
No, I did, and I mean the joke is like when their companies are doing well, I'm their best friend, and when they're not, I'm their worst enemy. And so I think I've had that conversation with every one of the grading companies at this stage. But no, I think they get that. Look, I'm not doing anything special here, and I'm not sort of I'm just pulling from the pop report. And so when they see that things are different, it's usually something that just is process oriented around sort of there's some discrepancy between when they do something internally and sort of when something hits the pop report. There's sometimes. For example, the biggest outlier here is probably Beckett, which, Beckett does a lot of grading that doesn't hit the pop report. They do BCCG, which, whatever, you can have your own opinion on that, but that's capacity that they put towards grading cards, and that doesn't show up on a pop report. And, I think sometimes they're frustrated that that doesn't show up in the numbers, but there's not much I can do there. It's not the way that sort of, pop reports are appreciated, and it's a different service, and it serves, it's servicing the hobby in a different way. They have BAS, they have the authentication services, which really will hit the CERT database, but it's not going to hit the pop report. And so again, they're doing volume, for example, that's not necessarily going to be represented in the data that I publish. And so, there's some caveats there to what I'm doing, but it's consistent. And so, I think what I hope is that, at some point, these companies can also sort of take some of this into their own hands and publish complementary data or supplementary data to what I'm doing and sort of, tell their own story in some ways. For example, Beckett, if you look at our data, people really think that Beckett's doing poorly. But, if you actually sort of zoom out and look at some of their trends, they have a very sort of loyal base that's still grading a lot of really valuable cards with them. And their data was actually up year over year. You just wouldn't know that. I mean, I don't publish that in the way that sort of I collect the data, but I know that from some of the other ways that we collect data. And, you could see that there's like a pretty strong story for some elements of their business. They certainly aren't growing at the way that people would have wanted them to, given sort of how well they were doing and just how much value is in Beckett slabs on the market today and how much people sort of have a rooting interest in them doing well in the long run. But, there's an opportunity for them to sort of advance that story. I'm just telling one angle, one part of it. And so hopefully this sort of just, again, brings more data to market. And it doesn't necessarily, in some ways it may end up contradicting some of what we're doing. I think it'll more likely be complementary to what we're doing. But it's a good dialogue. I mean, I appreciate that the companies are willing to reach out to me. I think that at this stage too, as I think about like more of the universal pop report and things like that, like to your point, this is better visibility and more visibility for what they're doing. So, it's one less thing that they have to think about in some ways. It's just, we got to get our ducks in a row and make sure we're doing our best behind the scenes. But, the data is going to tell the story of a lot of what's happening at these companies. And it's more just on them to sort of execute at this stage. But it's a little less of that sort of falls on them from a promotion standpoint, unless they want to sort of go forward with their own sort of marketing story.
Yeah, no doubt, and I think it's a great tool, and I like I said, I think it's great for those grading card companies that that you're putting them out there in the forefront. With that being said, have you don't necessarily have to mention by name if it is the case. Have you had another grading card company that you don't necessarily report on say, hey, we want we want publish our numbers or like offer this when they might not have a pop report or a registry, but they'll say, "We'll tell you, and can you put us on the board?" Has that happened? Again, you don't necessarily have to say their name unless you want to, but has that occurred with maybe a grading company that doesn't appear on Gemrate?
It has, and we appreciate that. Like we would love to include, there's certainly bandwidth requirements on our end, and it's also, it's a little bit of more noise on, we have very limited sort of space and opportunity in the way that we communicate today. We only send out one monthly email. We try to limit what we're doing on social to not sort of jam up people's feeds, and that's worked well for us. And so, we just have somewhat limited real estate by design right now. And if the hobby sort of asks for it, it's not the companies asking for it, we'll do it. But the companies themselves are interested because it's good promotion. It's good for them to sort of be seen, in the light of the larger companies and see how well they're tracking. And they probably do have pretty good momentum too. So I'm sure it would tell a decent story around what they're doing. But until sort of we have some sort of groundswell of people asking for it, it's work on our end to maintain. And it needs to be something that people want to see and care about, being in their feeds. And so, but that's all to say that we're certainly open to it, but it just has to sort of be demanded by the market as opposed to some sort of push by a company.
Yeah, no doubt. Uh, you know, eh, we on the user end, right? We get to read it, and it's easy to decipher. And I think sometimes, probably myself included, right? We take for granted the work and effort that it goes in to get that information. I mean, talk a little bit. I don't want you to give this Colonel Sanders recipe, but talk about the effort and work and has it changed? Whether have the grading companies maybe not even intentionally, but some of the things they're doing, does that throw you off where you have to sort of readjust your methods? Kind of speak to how the sausage gets made, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, look, from a reporting standpoint, it's a lot of work. I've gotten it down to a decent sort of routine or sort of process where it's instead of it being a week of prep and sort of 2 days of scrambling to get a report out. I've got a little bit more time now where and there's a ton of data modeling. So my background was head of analytics at startups for about 8 years prior to doing this, and so part of this was just keeping fresh on a lot of what I was doing. And then it's actually been much more around like innovating around some of the techniques I used to use at startups. Now I get to use it at my own company. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. And, there's a lot of tooling. We have a data warehouse. We pull data from one source to another, do a lot of modeling on top of that. And it, works and runs really well. But to your question, I mean, stuff gets recategorized. And so, sometimes I have to look at the data and just say, hey, is this a real trend or is this just some sort of, behind the scenes switching of a category or set or, cards that have been sort of just, again, it could be as simple as moving the word hollow from a card and all of a sudden all the data looks like there's certain strength in one category versus another. And it's not exactly that, but I mean, small changes can make a big difference. And so, there's a lot of actually the reporting is now sanity checking and just understanding, is this a true trend or is this something that is just, a function of data changes on the source side of things. And we've got a lot of pieces in place now to help. And I have a couple people supporting me now that are on a contract basis, which has been amazing for me just to help with a lot of like the execution of putting together some of the materials, helping me double check a lot of the things we're doing. And we also, one of the bets that we made early on was sort of like I collect this data every day, so I can go back and look at the state of sort of grading on any given day since I started collecting this a little over 2 years ago now. And so I can go, if I have a question around, hey, did something change? I can go verify it very quickly and look at the data and say, okay, this was what this looked like a week ago or a month ago. And so that's one of the advantages of our process of having daily cataloging of all the pop reports, is that we can just understand what's happening and we don't have to sort of, reach out to the companies. We can just look into the data and sort of, it'll tell its own story a lot of times. But it's a lot of work. I mean, honestly, it's a ton of work, but it's worth it. We get a lot of great, just feedback on it. The email we send out monthly is really well received. And so, to the degree that people appreciate, I mean, we'd even like to sort of extend on what we're doing, but I don't want to sort of force the issue. It's more of, if the market's calling for other sort of deeper dives or other ways for us to look at the data, we'll do it. But we're sort of just right now content with sort of doing what we've been doing, but there's certainly opportunities. I mean, we're only scratching the surface of sort of like what this data will yield as it relates to just trends in the hobby. And so there's more opportunity there, but I'd have to hire more people on the content side, and it's not really been my focus at the current, moment.
Yeah, you mentioned a few people, added to the team that sort of help the effort and what you're doing. Going back to sort of when you first started it, um, do you ever like, you know, scratch your head and say, "What did I get myself into?" Or was it really pretty smooth sailing?
Oh no, I had a lot of moments where I was just, am I on, like you can have a good jockey and a good horse, but you could be in the wrong race. And I was just wondering if I was in the wrong race for, a couple months. Cause it's a lot of work, honestly. And it's part of what's unsexy about it, which is what made it attractive to me is I just knew that this wouldn't be something that you could just dabble with and sort of, make sense of. You'd have to really commit to it. And it did play into a lot of my strengths with finance and data as sort of the 15 years of my career prior to this. And so, I sort of knew if I could persevere that there would be a lot of opportunity on the other end of it, but it's just hard. It's just a lot of work. It does change. And I don't have, as good as I think my relationships are with the companies, it's not like I'm talking to them every day. And so I have to do a lot of sort of validation of trends and sort of data checks that, it just can sometimes be a nuisance. And it's the same time because I'm using, pulling in data from pop reports, I just am subject to changes that companies make too, which they should do. They're continuing to evolve, but when they change, I have to change. And so, I built a ton of systems to prepare for that and to sort of anticipate that. But, at the end of the day, there's still a little bit of defense that I play of just like, hey, what's happening on sort of the greater side of things? And I have to wake up every morning and sort of see if it's going to be a normal day and one where I'm playing offense or if it's one where I'm sort of catching up on changes that companies have made. And, it's kind of what makes it fun too. There's sort of a lot of variability in the days, but it's also sometimes I'm like, oh man, I would just love to sort of push out an extra piece of content this month or something like that. But it's just, there's a lot of unknowns still in what I do, which I'm sort of a chaos junkie and I'm okay with that. But again, if you're not okay with that, this is not sort of the data set to be working with.
I like that term, chaos junkie. I might steal that somewhere down the line
It's all
at
yours.
some point. But from when you launched to where you are now, too, is it still as time consuming? Have you streamlined it where maybe it's a little bit less taxing? Again, I know you said you added a few people, but generally, like the time you put into it, is it stayed kind of steady, or have you sort of crafted it where it maybe it's taking less time to get crunch the numbers, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the first year and a half, what I was doing was more sort of the defense side of things, which is building the data infrastructure to sort of, capture the data and also sort of anticipate changes and react to data changes and, make sure that all the data downstream is sort of working as expected or sort of looks as expected. The harder part now, and so, it's a lot of work now is sort of this merging of the different conventions every company has with the grading data. We want to build this universal pop report, which is what does 68 tops look like each grading company when they don't sort of have the sort of same hierarchy of the way that they sort of look at cards. They also don't have the same breakout of the way they think about varieties and parallels. And so most of the work and sort of the headache now comes from just looking at the data and thinking about how do we sort of understand what the historical data looks like, and then how do we sort of prepare for this sort of world we're in, which is sort of the junk parallel era that a lot of people refer to, which is just like there's a lot of variations of cards out there. And the grading companies are sort of in the same way that I'm at the mercy of their changes. They're at the mercy of the manufacturers who are still sort of building out their own data infrastructure and being more transparent about what they're doing. It's not like they're handing the grading companies checklists with images that are ready to go the moment that they sort of start shipping cards. They have to sort of wing it a bit too. And so, that results in, downstream impacts to me. But most of the work now, most of the headache is around the merging of the data sets, which we've done. We've made so much progress. That's been my big goal over the last 12 months, is sort of building out this universal pop report. And it's not necessarily a universal pop report and how you're going to go to gemrate.com and you're going to see, I'm going to select 1968 tops and I'm going to see that across all the grading companies. Right now, we're really focused on how do we actually bring that to where people are collecting today. And so, we've got some new partnerships in place with like Card Ladder, Card Hedge. We've got some other companies that we're working with where that data will be available where you're collecting, so that it sort of helps enhance the experience. We don't need to be a destination site. We're not necessarily trying to siphon traffic away from the pop reports or the individual grading companies, but we do think this data could be better distributed and better accessed by other tools in the space. So that's been our primary focus and most of what we were working on the last 12 months. And that's been the shift. So the content side of things, the collection side of things, I don't want to say it runs itself. By no means is that the case, but it's definitely like we've got systems in place and sort of processes in place that help support a lot of that. And it's a lot less of that's not where the chaos is. It's more around the merging of the, building out of this universal pop report.
the hobby collectors have always kind of wanted the grading companies sort of to come together, at least for, like you said, a universal population report. I'm going to tell you, like, I don't ever see that going to be the case, right? They're not, and they may not necessarily be enemies or that sort of thing, but I don't think they're going to share information between each other. So I think what you and Gemrate are doing is so invaluable, because it's really going to be the closest thing the hobby will get to what we would call a universal pop report. Ryan, I mean, do you agree? Do you agree with that? Do you ever see a day where maybe these grading companies, maybe, I'm not saying partner up, but maybe align to for information sharing and publishing? Or do you feel like you're going to be that outside force that kind of produces what the hobby wants?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I try to break things down into sort of first principles around like why they would be interested in doing that. And, there's candidly the incentives haven't been there, and it's been pretty. People have been pretty close guarded with their data historically, and so I think they're now building up more of a tolerance around, hey, we should actually be more open, and their better data will sort of bring more participants into the hobby. You're much less likely to feel like you got hoodwinked when you buy your first card if you have better data available, and it's kind of like it'd be like going into buy a stock without knowing sort of a market cap or shares outstanding and stuff like that. And that's kind of like what cards historically has been. And so to the degree that we can bring more data to the hobby and sort of help present an information, paint a better picture, or sort of the full picture, or at least as close as we can get to that. I think there's an idea that a lot of companies are incentivized at this stage to grow the hobby. You had Fanatics coming in, who's going to be incredibly, motivated to grow this hobby. You have PSA, who raised a lot of money at a valuation that supports a growing hobby. Same thing with a lot of the sort of other private companies in the space. They've definitely staffed up in a way that they expect this hobby to grow. So I think as long as collectively there's an understanding of, or this belief that better data will sort of make the hobby a little bit more approachable without it sort of coming at the expense of what people love, which is a little bit of the treasure hunt and sort of the idea of, finding an angle or finding an edge in the data. That I do think that there's an opportunity for the companies to work together. Will they do that, or who's going to initiate that? Not totally clear, and it's not the battle that I necessarily want to fight yet. I definitely think there's an idea around maybe some sort of consortium of data sharing and some entity that sort of is independent, but sort of that they all participate in, and or at least have some sort of, I don't know, say in sort of the objectives. But I don't know how likely that is in sort of the near term. But you do have some forces that could help push that with Fanatics, eBay. They might say, hey, we'll be willing to share more on the manufacturing side if you'd be willing to work together on the grading side, or if you're willing to work together on sort of the pricing side of things, eBay, maybe we'll do a little bit more on our end to sort of share data with you as well. So I think if people can kind of get their ducks in a row, and I think there's some idea that could happen, it's possible. I just, it's not been the sort of way that things have been, but there's been a lot of turnover, and there's been a lot of changes in the approach to sort of a lot of these companies and sort of what their objectives are. So I think it's possible, but it definitely, data was not their number one goal initially for any of these companies, is to sort of get their operational ducks in a row, which, some of the companies are ahead of others in that spectrum. And I do think, though, the data is going to fuel a lot of sort of the momentum here in the long run. And I do think Fanatics is going to ask for that. And so we'll see is the short answer to that. And I'd like to sort of window as much of that as I can. And I do think like the universal pop report that we're going to roll out is going to be pretty slick. And I think it will suffice in a lot of ways. But, at the end of the day, we'd still be better served if there's cooperation, I think. And so, there's only so much that we can do as sort of a independent player in this market. So we'll see. But I definitely think cooperation's on the table, at least. Whether that happens is, very much TBD.
Yeah, I'm not saying they would do it, even if they could. Is there a way, one of these grading companies, grading company A, that you track, they could do something internally to, whether inflate the numbers or give a false reading, so to speak? Is that something they could? I'm not saying they would do it, but is there a way, if they wanted to, do something maybe not morally or ethically right? Could they internally do that to kind of inaccurate the numbers you put out? Not your fault, but
Totally.
could they do something to throw what you're doing off and not be accurate?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that's a possibility, and I'm hyper aware of it. I go through. I sort of never publish anything without at least sort of questioning sort of the data and thinking about, is this a real? Even today we published weekly trends, and I was something sort of caught my eye, and I did spend an hour that I wasn't expecting to do, sort of just researching if it was a real trend or something that was just something that was sort of new to the data that was making it look stronger or different than maybe or just a different way of reporting data than it was the prior week. Um, I mean, there's definitely timing considerations here. For example, when companies will grade cards before they add them to the pop report, and all of a sudden, you'll see 25,000 cards show up that weren't there before, and that's something I try to account for. I'll throw a lot of like anecdotes into our reports just to say, hey, this set was brought on, and if you actually look at when they started grading it versus when it hit the pop report, take into consideration this was a 6-month timeline, that these cards that just showed up today and look like they hit the January or February numbers, they were actually graded over a 6-month period. So just know that they're maybe a little bit inflated. I do think a company could, in theory, put a marketing budget towards saying, hey, we're going to just buy a bunch of cards and run them through our system and make our numbers look stronger according to Gemrate data. And so there's some element of how natural the numbers look in my eyes. And so at some point, I do it now, but there's some sort of systematic way I'd like to sort of, at least sort of try to corroborate what we're seeing from a grading standpoint, from a sales standpoint as well, and just see if that sort of, sort of plays through in the market as well. Grading a card is only part of the equation. And so, does it actually, a lot of times, most of the times, these cards will make their way to the market. And so I do a lot of sanity checks with the sales data as well. But the short answer is, yeah, I mean, you could get a little funky with the data if you wanted to. I don't think that would be in the best interest for anybody, obviously. But if you were sort of getting desperate, you could probably pull that lever. But on the other side of it, I'm sort of always looking for that because I don't want that to be, a possibility. And so it's for sure out. It's for sure out there as a thing. But I'd like to make sure that we're not responsible for things showing up that, can't, again, be explained or look unnatural. So we're definitely thinking about that.
So in a sense, they have a red button they could push, but you also have a satellite tracking system that will sort of detect launch, if you will.
Yeah, at the
in
very
order,
least, I can sort of, frame questions for people to ask of the data and say, yeah, here's like what we're seeing, but let's sort of be, a little bit cautious about sort of like how real this data looks. And again, nobody's doing that today, but again, I'm just aware of, this is a hobby that has a history of not being sort of like the most by the book and sort of, doing things above board. And so not saying that that is something that will happen or should happen or, is going to happen, but I've learned enough in my 3 years of research to sort of question the data and make sure that I'm sort of not, having one pulled over me because I'm not paying attention or just taking things sort of at the surface and not sort of digging a little bit deeper.
yeah, no doubt. And it's good to hear that it's something like you're aware of and monitoring if that be the case. You know, for me, one of the biggest surprises is how strong, the trading card game with grading is. I mean, you're in the trenches on the front lines. What's what sort of surprised you? What stands out to you over the last even couple years, if you want to like use that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the trading card game stuff has been the stuff that surprised me the most. And I still, I mentioned this on Hobby Hotline, and I think it's important to sort of reinforce, which is just like, I don't know how sustainable it is, but it's definitely where the momentum is. And, you just saw SGC launch a Pokemon special, which, the early
Yeah,
returns on that are really productive for them. It's a really lucrative market. My understanding of sort of the economics of TCG on the grading side is really lucrative. And so for the grading companies, there's a lot of incentive for them to bring on as much of that, capacity or sort of volume as they can. I'm not sort of sure to sort of on the point that I just mentioned as it relates to sort of the data as it flows through the pop report. I don't have a good understanding of sort of the sales side of that market yet, but I'm like, cautiously optimistic that there's a lot of people buying up those slabs, but there's a ton of slabs. And, me seeing what we just saw in the last 2 years with sports cards, I'm sort of at the same time, a little bit skeptical that there's just another bubble that's being built up there on the grading side, and there's not going to be, collectors on the other end of it. And so you're seeing an opportunity for some arbitrage, seeing an opportunity to sort of make a run on TCG based cards effectively. And so I'd like to think that there are people buying and sort of excited to sort of put those in their collections that they're in, but the volume is staggering. I mean, just staggering. It's 40% of, the million plus cards that are coming through every month. And it's across all the grading companies at this stage. SGC is obviously trying to ramp up their presence there, but it's a massive trend, and I'm curious to see sort of how long it can last. I think the grading companies would love to see it last for a long time, but I just don't know that market well enough. The other thing sort of on just the last couple of years is just, I think actually the market's been really smart of sort of, recalibrating. I think the sports card space did see sort of,
Yep.
The data doesn't sort of showcase this because it was lagged because of the PSA backlog. And there was, we were reporting on grading numbers from cards that were submitted, a year to a year and a half prior to that. And you've seen quickly that people just realize, number one, it's not, all the things sort of worked against grading base cards. What the price of wax went up, cost of grading went up, and the price of cards, the resale value of cards went down. And so, people pretty quickly realize there's not a lot of money in there, even if there was liquidity at one point in the market. And so I've been impressed to see sort of just I don't know if impressed is the right word, but just pleasantly surprised by how fast people and sort of how savvy people were to sort of understanding that trend. It's still, there's opportunities and that will be exploited to some degree still. And it'll probably get ahead of itself at some point if prices get really low on the grading side. But that's been one that I've been surprised to see how quickly it sort of corrected itself, which will be interesting to see if, pricing right now is roughly $12 to $20 for most of the grading companies. If pricing gets back to sort of the $8 to $12 level, do we start to see a run up on some of this? I'd like to think again that people are sort of, wiser based off of the historical trends we just saw, but we'll see. I mean, it's still, it certainly would juice that part of the market in the sense that certain cards would be available to grade again, but I don't think it'll be anywhere near. It'll be a fraction of what we saw, hopefully, at the peak in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, one last question too, if I may. We all, I use it to sort of, and maybe a decision on a direction I want to go hobby wise, or cards I sort of want to purchase. Doing it internally and being in those trenches as I refer to it. Is it something that helps you, or you know what I mean? It helps us out here, right? Is it internally? I imagine the same thing, right? Would you agree?
Oh yeah, no, as I sort of started the conversation, I didn't have a lot of discipline in the card world when I sort of was doing it as a kid. And, I sort of, I've realized now that, you have to sort of be patient in this hobby in a lot of ways. And, a lot of the decisions I've made over the last, I fortunately, when I got back in, I was sort of, skeptical of the idea of base and was buying low number stuff fairly early, or at least things that I thought were low pop if they weren't numbered. And, I sort of stayed the course there, but it's definitely just helped me think about timing and sort of, again, this is one of the reasons I want the Gemrate website to sort of continue to get built out is, it's a very narrative driven hobby. And there's a lot of questions that you couldn't necessarily answer previously that you can now do with our data, which is, hey, these case hits, there's never been any sort of easy way to aggregate it across all the grading companies. But now you can see, even though Panini wasn't putting serial numbers on there, you can kind of see how things trended as sort of print runs changed over time. And you can kind of really go to bat for some of the things you might have historically believed to be true, but never really had the data to do that. And so, I live and breathe that data. So a lot of the decisions I make in the hobby are based off of this data. And, that was really the reason that, like I said, this was not sexy data to sort of pull together. And I never really would have been able to fulfill this. And I'm still very early in the vision of what I want to build. But the idea that I use this data every day is part of what just gets me excited about it, honestly, is I still make active decisions every day on this data. I'm going into Gemrate for different reasons, just for things that I sort of see a card I've never heard of comes up on my radar, and I just sort of want to understand the landscape. And so it's super helpful from that standpoint. And then the macro stuff is just very interesting as it relates to where do I want to send my cards. I would say I'm fairly unbiased given what I do and sort of how I want to sort of be perceived in the hobby. But so I try almost every grading company. I don't really have strong loyalty to any one company because it's just, not that I don't want to, but I just like to sort of explore sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these companies. And so it definitely has helped me sort of understand sort of where the strengths are and sort of, some of the places that companies still have room for growth. But this data definitely impacts a lot of my day to day.
All right, I lied. I got one more question, but it's
Yeah,
a
hit
funny
me.
one. I know you love this stuff, Ryan. Your passion is evident. Like you said, you love doing this. You ever wake up though one day, like a lot of people at work, and say, "I really don't want to do this."
I mean, honestly, I love it. I love it. It's like so. I don't want to sound like too corny or cliche about it, but I mean, it's my passion. So I get to wake up
Yeah,
and sort of look at sports card data and sort of, I'm not just I'm doing it as a hobby, but I'm also doing it as a profession now. But just real quick sort of tangent. I had opportunity to work in like the DFS world and like the daily fantasy sports world, and
yeah,
but I love sort of doing the fantasy stuff, and I didn't want it to ever be my profession. It just was something
yeah,
a line that I didn't want to cross, and actually I don't really do it that much anymore, and so maybe it wasn't that strong of a passion for me. This card stuff being my profession, I love it just as much as I did when I got back into it a few years ago, because there's just so much to learn, and you can really never really be fully up to speed in it. And so, it's exciting. I mean, it's exhausting. I mean, there are days I go to bed and I'm like, holy cow, like that was a lot of just like a lot of unexpected things that happened, and things to triage. But it's fun. I enjoy it. Like
yeah,
I to your questions earlier, I've got a bit of a routine around it now, and I have a lot of sort of
yeah.
aspirations around what we build here. So it's exciting. It's exhausting. So it's less something that I don't look forward to. It's definitely something I do look forward to, and it's more just it can be exhausting. Like I'm just ready to hit the hay and get to bed.
Yeah. Well, you're a busy guy. I appreciate you making some time, and I will say this, in going on the site, how you've got it, like by player, by different niches of the hobby. It's just super detailed and a great tool, for whether you're a serious hobbyist or even sort of a novice or someone that's just kind of ramping up what you're doing. It's great tool, a great reference point to kind of see, trends, what's going on, even on a player level. Forget even the grading company level, but even what players are being submitted at what levels, and just there's something for whatever your angle is or whatever info you're kind of searching for. It's really all there. So with that being said, better you to kind of direct people where they can, your website, any socials you want to share. Take your time, give that information out today.
Yeah, I would just say visit gemrate.com. A lot of people come to Gemrate as a starting point. They have an idea of a player they're interested in picking up as a new PC, and they just want to understand the landscape of graded cards. It's a great place to start. And I would say that Gemrate's really great, sort of as you're close to making a decision, just as a sanity check to make sure there's not, the a bunch of cards that have been graded with a different company that you weren't expecting to see it. You can figure that stuff out pretty quickly. But I would say the site is early and sort of what we want it to be, but is a great tool today to check out. I would recommend, if you're interested in sort of the broader trends, signing up for our email. We send it only once a month, and it's a long email, but it has a lot of interesting data in there.
Yeah.
And then we publish a ton of daily trends, weekly trends, and monthly trends on our social, and so Instagram, Twitter. I'd like to, like I said earlier, we'd like to do more content there. We're just not quite there yet. There's a lot of sort of unanswered questions. And then the last thing I'll just add is email me at ryan@gemrate.com if you have any feedback, things you'd like to see. It's in particular, I'm really interested in this, feedback of how people might utilize the universal pop report. It's one of these things everybody's talked about as sort of this mythical thing that will probably never exist, but we're really close to delivering on it. But we want to make sure that it's going to sort of exist in a way that people would like to see it exist or make use of it. And so really interested in hearing people's feedback on just, ways that they might make use of a universal pop report that's not necessarily available to them today in sort of the current landscape of grading data.
Yeah, the unicorn of the hobby. I'll call it at that point. So
I don't know if we want to live up to or have that lofty of a label to us, but we definitely aspire for it to be useful. Let's put it that way.
well, you're doing a tremendous job. Continued success. I know it's something I pay a lot of attention to. It's even not even to buy necessarily, but just to even. It's just interesting even to look and see the dynamic and how things change or don't change, and where they change, and it's just. It's fun. It's, even if you're a little bit, I might not be as into the numbers as you are, but even if you're a little bit like you are, it's interesting even for that level of analytics. So again, continued success, Ryan. Thanks for some time today.
No, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.